anybody's house. Praise God for his protection. So anyways, so glad that each one of you are here tonight for our marriage seminar. We're going to go ahead and start with prayer, and then I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to David. So let's bow our heads here for a word of prayer. Father in heaven, Lord, we want to thank you so much, Lord, for your goodness and your mercy, which is new every morning. I want to thank you, Lord, for the families that are here, Lord, the marriages that are represented. Lord, we pray that you would bless each of us, Lord, as we have come here, Lord, to learn and to grow. And I pray that you would please be with David as he shares with us tonight. Lord, please speak through him, and pray that we could apply these principles to our lives and to our marriages. Lord, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing this evening? Yes? Well, today we are going to be continuing with our discussion on the 7 principles that make marriage work. Today I wanted to make sure that I was able to display the book. So if anybody has ever seen this book before, it's actually written by John Gottman and Nan Silver. They were the 2 authors that co-authored this book, set the 7 principles for making marriage work. And so if you are interested in the material that we've been presenting each evening, this would be the book to get. John Gottman is a researcher who has been working up in Seattle and has had his marriage lab for now, I think it's been a little over 30 years, and has been studying marriage and finding out what it is that helps marriages to work. So again, that's the book title, and that is where a good amount of the information is actually coming from for our presentation on these evenings. Now, how many people were here for the last time that for the first evening? Okay, perfect. All right, so at the end of that, everyone received some handouts, and the handouts were on developing that fondness and admiration, which is a little bit of a sneak preview of what we're going to be talking about this evening. So I'm not sure how many people had a chance to go through that, but hopefully as you're going through that and you're walking through those steps, you're noticing some of the ways in which we can continue to improve our communication with each other. So this evening we're going to be looking at nurturing your friendship and your marriage. And so you'll probably recall from the first evening that we talked a little bit about the sound relationship house, which I wanted to show you up here. And so Gottman talked about how these 7 principles serve as this relationship house that actually serves to show how we begin to build up these 7 principles. And so today we'll be taking a closer look at those bottom 3 stages there, which is going to be building off the love maps, sharing fondness and admiration, and turning toward. So before we get any further with that, I wanted to make sure that we started by reviewing some questions that came in. So I was going to have Jennifer come up here and read some of our questions that we have. Thank you.
All right. So we did have some questions, and one of them has to do with the love maps that you just mentioned. So someone asked, could you re-explain what the love maps are?
Okay, excellent. So the love maps are a list of questions to help you get to know one another better. Now, you'll notice that your life didn't just come to a standstill after you get married. Like, you continue to have life experiences, you go through job changes, you go through the changes of having children. There are things about your life that continue to change over time. And one of the examples that came to my mind is there was a couple who the husband was a real workaholic. He worked as a physician in the hospital, and he was so unaware of his family that he didn't know his dog's name, he didn't know the names of his wife's best friends, and he actually had forgotten, I think, someone's birthday within the family. So that is when the love map is horrible. That's not good to be able to forget so many things, but if you asked about his job, he would have all kinds of specifics. And so his job was better mapped out than his marriage was. And so building love maps is actually getting to a place where you do know these things about your spouse, because the more that you know about your spouse, the easier it is to understand them and really connect with them. And so maintaining that interest in one another and constantly updating those maps, just like a real roadmap does for you, is something that has been shown to be fundamental in a relationship.
All right, next question. What would you recommend to a couple where there's no more passion?
All right. So oftentimes, if there's no passion left in the relationship, sometimes people just immediately assume that maybe it's because of a lack of physical desire for one another. But when they have looked at what contributes to satisfaction, especially with regard to romance in the relationship and intimacy, they have found that if people can comfortably talk about their romantic relationship, if they can talk about that with each other in a way that feels open and safe for each other, then they actually enjoy intimacy far more than people who don't talk about it. And what was interesting is that it was the same thing for men and women. And so men who were able to talk more openly about what they enjoy in their romantic lives with their spouses were actually rated higher satisfaction in their romantic lives if they were able to do that. The second thing is that, similar to what you'll see in tonight's handout, that if you are able to turn toward and pay more attention to your spouse, it turns out that that actually begins to increase attraction to one another. So the more you pay attention, the more you pick up on these subtle cues. Sometimes we can take for granted when your spouse comes home or you come home from something and you start to talk, and we can just get caught up in multitasking. Maybe you're working on the car or somebody's doing the dishes, when if you can actually stop and look at the person and actually attend to them and acknowledge that they're talking to you, this actually heightens attraction and desire within the marriage. And so if the passion is gone, it's usually not just because of what happens in the bedroom, it is because of what's happening outside of it first, because everything starts from there. Gottman kind of glibly said that, all communication within the relationship is leading to the bedroom. So anyway, you can take that and understand that how you will, but it is what really contributes to the passion being returned into a marriage. Hope y'all don't mind that I talk so frankly about all this, because, this is what I do all day. So, all right, next
All
question.
right, our last question. What do you suggest when one spouse doesn't want to change?
Okay, so oftentimes if somebody says that they don't want to change, a lot of what is happening is that person has gotten to a place where they either don't believe they can change, or they just believe, or they've gotten to the place where at least they communicate that they believe everything is the fault of the other person. One of the best ways to help somebody want to change is to show the person how, like 4 things, it's an easy acronym to remember, is DARN, D-A-R-N. Desires, abilities, reasons, and needs. If you can help somebody identify, number 1, how their desires are not being met by just staying the same, that tends to motivate people a little bit. It's like, I really hate this job. It's like, okay, well, so what is it that you're really wanting? Well, I would really love to have a career that's really more focused in art or in computers. You start talking about the things that they really desire, and people are more likely to change because they recognize they can't get what they desire without making a change in behavior first. The second one is abilities. Complement that person's abilities to step out and take risks if we're just talking about a job change. The more you build that person up in their abilities to move forward, the more likely they are to change. Reasons. You look at what are their primary reasons for wanting to make this change in their life, and you talk more about those with your spouse. And then needs is the last one, is like, what needs are not being met by staying the same? And if you can do these 4 things in your conversations with each other, people are far more likely to want to change because it becomes their own personal reason for wanting to change and not you telling them to. So, hope that makes sense to everyone. Yeah. All right, so every evening we will have a little question box in the back, and at any time, if you all have questions, make sure that you put those back there, and I'll make sure to answer them at the beginning of each one of our meetings. But for this evening, we're going to be looking at how to nurture your friendship. And I believe that the last time we were here, we were looking at this relationship house, but tonight, for the nurturing your friendship, the first 3 steps are building the love maps, which is what we talked about last time. The second one is fondness and admiration, and the third one is turning toward. Okay, so this is that sound relationship house that we already mentioned. Now, one thing I like to mention early on as well is being aware of the 4 horsemen. Now, when you think of 4 horsemen, what comes to mind for everyone? Any pictures come to mind? Huh? Horses, right? So you have the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right? I mean, so you read about that in the book of Revelation. So John Gottman very humorously was pointing out that you can actually have these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse of a relationship. And these 4 horsemen are as follows. Criticism. The very moment that criticism begins to creep into a relationship, it actually begins to create more and more negative sentiment. There's a big difference between saying, it really makes me upset when you don't help with the dishes, versus, how can you be so stupid and lazy? Why would you just let the dishes sit there and pile up? Now, not only can you hear the difference, but you can feel the difference when someone talks to you that way. Once criticism begins to rush in, then the next horseman follows closely behind, and that is defensiveness. So as you can imagine in this conversation, if someone says, how stupid can you possibly be? Why are you so lazy? Why don't you do the dishes? It's really easy to retaliate and say, well, look, I saw you sitting around last week, and how come you never filled the gas tank? It becomes really, really easy to just respond and show the other person that they're no better than you are, which that's always helpful, right? Everybody's had a good time after that. Okay, so defensiveness, not really helpful. The third one is contempt. So contempt, a good way to think about contempt is when anger turns cold. So active hot anger is like where you're really frustrated and angry at somebody because they did something that really made you angry and upset, whereas contempt is kind of like that cold anger where it's almost just kind of like there was a nice little graphic, I wish I could have used it, and it was this physician, and it says on their empathy fail, and like the man comes in and says, I've got this terrible headache, doc, I don't know what's going on, and then the doctor says, I hope you die. And so underneath it says empathy fail. And that is a good illustration of what contempt is like. It's when we get to the place where we just have no confidence in the person's ability to change. We start to actually despise them as a human being. Like these things can begin to creep into the marriage. And so when contempt shows up, not a good step. Last one, the 4 horsemen, is stonewalling. And we talked a little about this last time, but when the argument gets to a place where one person is just completely shut down, arms crossed, doesn't want to respond to anything that their spouse is saying, it's like, hey, can't you hear me? I just asked you something. Why are you just going to sit there and just look at the TV and not pay attention to me? That's stonewalling. When stonewalling comes into the relationship, this often becomes one of the 4 horsemen. So if these things have showed up in your relationship or they're present now, these are things to begin attending to immediately. It doesn't necessarily mean it can't be reversed, but without those things being checked, these 4 horsemen, if they stick around, can end up being the death of a marriage. Now, each one of these has an antidote to it, and we'll actually look at those in more detail in the nights to come. All right. So the next one I wanted to take a look at was enhancing your love maps. Now, how many people got a chance to look at the questions on the love maps one where it was all right, anybody do pretty well answering those questions? Like anybody feel like you got a good score on that? You don't necessarily have to share what your score was, but anybody feel like you did okay? Anybody feel like you need a little bit of work need to learn a little more about your spouse? All right, so in these questions, the purpose of this is to continuously update your maps because as human beings, we change over time. Now, we had an assignment when I was in high school. I was a freshman in high school, and my English teacher, I'll never actually forget him. He was just super intelligent. And I remember the first day that we came into his class, he said, all right, everybody tell me your names. And he went through and got the names of every single one of the freshman English students. Now, the thing about freshman English is that everybody had to take it. And our freshman class, when I was in high school, was like almost 978 children. Like, that's a lot. That's a huge freshman class. And so all of them would have to cycle through his class at some point. And as he was standing there, he named every single one of the kids and made sure he got their names down. He said, all right, my goal is to have all your names memorized by the end of this week. And lo and behold, he did. And I was like, Mr. Fly, that's incredible. How did you do that? And so, but it wasn't just our class, because he had to memorize the names of all the freshmen in all the classes. And you know what happened is some 4 years later, after I graduated from high school, I had this job that I thought was paying really well. I worked at a grocery store, and I saw Mr. Fly walking in the parking lot with his wife. This was 5 years later. And I see him, and I'm like, Mr. Fly. And he went like this, David. And I just was like, okay, that's skill. Well, that wasn't his only skill. His other skill was coming up with genius assignments. And one of our genius assignments was we all had to write a letter to our future selves. And he said, give me an address that's permanent. Like, give me the address of somebody that you know is not going to move in the next 4 or 5 years. Now, I would task you all with this assignment too. If you just really want to do a test to see whether or not you change over time, try this one out. And so he said, write a letter, and I want you to describe yourself, how you are now, and what you hope you'll be like in the future. What are the things that are important to you now? And I remember when I was 18 years old, my aunt received the letter, and then she said, hey, David, this is a letter addressed to you from you. It's like, okay. And so I opened it, and oh my, things have changed. Lo and behold, all the stuff that I thought was so cool and so important now seems trivial and silly. And that's just my own individual change. Now, the same thing can happen in your relationship. if you don't stay updated on each other, then eventually you walk into a room and then suddenly you don't know who the stranger is anymore. It's like, who is this person? Why are they so upset all the time? Or why are they so happy about these things? I've lost track of them. Keep your maps up to date. All right, so some things that you can do to keep up on those changes is to ask open-ended questions. So when you talk to each other, ask interesting and open-ended questions to get to know each other more effectively. Like one question is, what would you want your life to look like in 3 years? Now, let me just ask you a question. Do any of you think you know what the answer would be from your spouse if you asked them in detail, like what you want your life to look like in 3 years? Maybe, maybe not. It's actually really difficult, and it can change on a daily basis. But this is actually fuel for useful conversation. The second one that I used up there as just an example is, how is your life different from your parents at this age or stage? Sometimes we don't consider those things. Another one is, who are your best friends? Who are the people that you consider to be your best friends right now? I've noticed as we get older, you know that it's harder to make friends as you get older. Yes, because you need more specific details to match up. You know, when you were little, the only thing that you need to have in common was that you both wanted to play. That was it. Now our standards hopefully have come a little higher than that, and if they haven't, then let's talk later. Okay. So making friends becomes more difficult, so best friends will begin to change over time. I like this one. It says, if you could live at any other time in history, when would it be? Learn to be more interested in each other. Ask each other interesting questions. Learn about each other, because you can really start to develop that fondness and that desire to know the person better. I did want to share with you a quick word, and this word here is actually taken from Hebrew, and the word is yadah, and it's the Hebrew word for to know. And so in the book of Genesis, it says that, and Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bare a son and called his name Cain. Now, it says that he knew his wife, and then she had a child. So, from that definition, what does it mean to know? Well, it means to know someone intimately. And so I wanted to find out, like, why does that word mean what it means? Well, the da part, the da part, is a contraction of two different words. The D the D sound is actually from where we get our own letter D. If you actually look at that letter, the reason it's shaped that way is because it used to be a tent door, and it used to be shaped more like this. And what it actually meant was like a door, and that's made that sound of da, which is where we get our letter D. Isn't that fascinating? The A sound is actually an I. So if you actually look at it, it's an eyeball over time that transformed into a different letter. But that A sound comes from the letter, comes from the original character that looks like an I. And so what the original word for knowledge was an eye and a door, or like the opening through the eyes, from which one gains knowledge. What do we call our eyes, by the way? We call it the window to the soul. So that's the half of the word there, at least the da part is like that window into the soul. It's how we come to know something, is by receiving information and seeing it, right? But the Y there is actually a letter that originally was turned on its side, and it looked like kind of like these two sticks sticking out like this and an arm, and that's because it was an arm with a hand on the end of it. And so if you piece these things together, what the word yadah meant was not just to know something based on information and visual stimuli, but it meant to know something through experience, through holding, through handling. And it's an intimate knowledge, and this is why when Adam knew his wife, she was pregnant. It's an intimate knowledge. Interesting enough, that theme doesn't just end there. It's actually even in the, I always kind of wondered why it was that in some of these, in some of the parables, you know, there's this, the master of the wedding feast is depicted saying to the people that come there, he doesn't know them. But this is supposed to be God, and how can God not know somebody? Well, it's not talking about facts, because that would just be the second half of the word, like to just know something factually. What he's talking about is, I don't have an experience with you, and you don't have an experience with me. So when we're talking about building these love maps, the idea is to have an intimate and close knowledge of the other person. All right, does this make sense so far to everyone? All right, excellent. So how can we begin to build those? I would encourage you to go through those exercises and learn more about how you can enhance your love maps, but continue to update these on a daily basis. All right, how about fondness and admiration? Fondness and admiration are crucial to happy relationships. Remembering your partner's positive qualities strengthens the bond between you, even as you struggle with each other's flaws. Sometimes we forget how how little encouragement it really takes in order to keep us going. I remember I was counseling with a couple, which I do this a lot, and I was sitting down with them, and one of the partners was just really, really upset. He was very distraught, was crying a lot, felt really embarrassed about crying because he didn't like crying in front of anyone. And while all this emotion was happening, the other person was just like, well, I don't know why they're so upset. I don't know why they're crying. And it's like, well, let's see if we can find out. And so I asked, like, what's happening here? It's like, well, it's not fair. It feels really embarrassing. Why am I the one that's always expressing all this emotion, and she doesn't seem to really care about what's going on? And so I asked, well, what is it that is actually causing you to hurt this way? And it's like, well, it feels like I'm losing them. It feels like I'm failing them. It feels like I'm not being a good father. I'm not being a good husband. And I said, your family is that important to you? Like, even to sit here in front of a perfect stranger, me, and express these kind of emotions in front of someone like me? And he's like, well, of course. I mean, I'd do anything for my family. And for the other person, they're just kind of like, they want the emotions to stop because they get really uncomfortable when somebody's crying. It's like, oh my goodness, what are we doing? And so I tried to slow this person down. I said, can you sit with this for a moment? Can you tell me what it's like to know that your spouse is terrified of losing you, and that the most important thing to them, even if it means not being able to maintain this facade of integrity in front of someone like me, is making sure that they don't lose you. What does that do for you? And then she was finally able to say, well, I guess that really lets me know how much that he loves me. And I said, well, can you share that with him? Can you tell him that this is a quality you appreciate about him? And she turned and actually said to him, it's like, I can see how much you love our family and how much we really matter to you. And you could just see him just melt. It doesn't take a lot of encouragement. It was just a single sentence, but it was a sentence that was well-timed and stated to the person, I can see you, and I admire this quality about you. So remembering your partner's positive qualities strengthens the bond. Look, you can ride off with something like that all day, because even if, later on she said, hey, you forgot to pick something up, it doesn't hurt so much because now I don't think that my spouse is looking at me and thinking that I'm weak or that I'm not a good enough person. I know they actually care about me, and it just incidentally, it happens they want me to pick something up. Not such a big deal now. A stronger bond makes it easiest to address problems and implement solutions. So fondness and admiration, these are also antidotes for contempt. So when we talked about that last one of those horsemen of contempt was the third one. If you can develop that fondness and admiration, then you're less likely to start to build up that contempt for the person. You start looking for things that you do appreciate and respect about the other person. One of the things that they found was that when somebody is falling into the state of not really being able to develop that fondness and admiration, and they're falling into that contempt, they were tracking how many times the other spouse would try to say something kind to them or try to reach out to them. And when you asked them how many nice things the other spouse did for them, they would miss at least 50% of what the other person was doing to try to show them that they cared, like making lunch for them or telling them, have a good day. You miss half of it just by simply being in a bad mood or being in a negative space. That's a huge difference. Because at the end of the day, it's like, you never do anything that shows me that you love me. And it's like, well, they've probably done at least twice as much as what you thought they did. But this can happen when we can become blind to those things. So when we have more of that fondness and admiration for each other, it makes a huge difference. I'm going to share with you a quick illustration of this. There's a gentleman, his name is Gregory Boyle, and he is a pastor in Dolores Mission Church. It's in a community that has the highest concentration of gangs in Los Angeles. And he talked about these two individuals that were part of this gang. One of them was called Youngster, and the other one was called Puppet. These are street names, and it's oftentimes that they won't go by their real names, but they will go by these street names because they're actually affectionately named by the gang members. Hence the reason that they're willing to die for them, which should tell you how important it is to feel like you belong and that someone cares about you. People will shoot and die and kill each other and will die as teenagers because somebody actually said they matter. Huge. So Youngster and Puppet, these are two different guys that were there. Puppet was somebody who was a part of this, it's called Homeboys Industries. It's actually a bakery that's started down in in Los Angeles. It's actually still open today, so if you ever wanted to go take a look at it. And what the pastor there had done is he had opened this place to help gang members get off of the street and get out of gangs. The last time I heard, there was something like almost 1,000 different street gangs in that part of LA alone, with over 80,000 gang members. So try to do the math on that. That's like almost 3 times as large as Centralia of just gang members. So you can imagine how dangerous that is out there in East LA, where people have tattoos all over their face and getting shot at is a daily occurrence. So these are the kind of lifestyle these young people are coming from. When they interviewed Puppet, he was talking about how he had already lost like 4 of his homies within like the last 4 months. It's too many people. I haven't lost that many friends yet at my age. So anyway, these 2 guys are working at this bakery. Youngster's kind of new to this whole game, and he walks in, and he's shaking hands with some of these guys who are rival gang members and enemies, and he greets every single person he sees until he gets to Puppet, and when they see each other, you can tell that they're from rival gangs, but that they don't seem to like each other, and they just kind of mutter something at each other, look at each other's shoes, and don't say anything. And so the pastor's like, hey, look, if you guys can't work together, just let me know. There's plenty of other people that would like to take your spot. But they continued to work together. And over that time, they began to develop a friendship. And in developing that friendship, they got to a place where they were no longer rivals. Now, what had happened one day was Puppet, the other gang member, he was ex-gang member, he decided to just go ahead and dodge down an alley to take a shortcut to get home. Now, when he went down there, he ended up running into 10 rival gang members that actually beat him within an inch of his life. And when they found him, like, his head had swollen up to several times its size because they had beaten him so badly. And when he was in the hospital, the youngster, the other gang member, had called him up and said, hey, man, that's messed up. What happened to him? And the pastor's like, yeah, it was. And he said, is there anything I can do? And he said, can I, like, give him my blood? And he tries to hold back his tears as he's realizing that he can't do anything to save his friend. Now, after this young man who was beaten, he actually ended up dying. The pastor thought for sure that youngster was just going to go back out to the streets, go get revenge, because that's what you do. Like, you don't let somebody just, kill somebody that you care about like that. You don't let them take out one of your homeboys without doing anything. And so he was really nervous that he wasn't going to make it. But he came back into the bakery one day, the very next day, actually, and when he came in, he could tell that he had some huge announcement that he wanted to make. And so when he came in there, he said, hey, G, his name is Gregory, I want to tell you something, man. And he said, okay, what happened? Yesterday, man, when I left, I got on the train to start heading home. And when I got on the train, there was this dude. He was probably an OG. I can tell he was in a gang, because I could see on his tats that he was in a gang, but he looked like he was a little bit drunk. And he was kind of getting loud on the train and was doing all this stuff. And he saw my shirt, and it said, Jobs, Not Jails, Homeboy Industries. And he said, hey, are you part of that program? And he's like, yeah. He said, well, does it work? And he said, yeah, it's kept me out of prison. He said, okay, that's cool. And so youngster pulls a piece of paper out of his pocket, writes down the name, the address, and he was like, man, I was surprised I could actually remember the address. Man, I can't believe I actually memorized it. And so he jotted it down on a piece of paper, and he gave it to the man. He's like, hey, man, you should come check us out. And the man said, thank you. And he stuck it into his pocket, and he got off the train. And then he said, what happened afterwards was something that I have never experienced in my entire life. He said, when he got off the train, people were looking at me. Everyone was smiling at me. Everyone started nodding their heads at me. And for the first time in my life, I felt admired. We can take for granted how valuable it is to show someone that they matter to us. And if we can build that admiration for one another, we can have that same impact on each other. All right. So we have a couple more that I wanted us to go through. And the next one that we're going to be looking at is turning towards. So this is that third principle upon which the relationship house stands. And it's the third part of what helps us to develop a friendship. So the first thing I want us to be able to do here is to take a look at what are some of the tips that help to build a stress-reducing conversation. Well, the first thing is you want to take turns. Because so often it could just be just one person does all the talking, and maybe the other one person just is listing out all these different complaints about what's going on. Take turns. Each person take 15 minutes to be the complainer. Now, when you're the complainer, you get to share these things. If you're in the listening role, just listen. Because something else that can happen is that when we're talking, we can fail to show genuine interest. So one thing I was going to see if we can do is I wanted to see if we can maybe do an exercise here. So most of you are maybe sitting next to someone, but I just want you to try this little experiment out with me. For the next moment here, what I'd like for you to do is to just talk about one challenge that you had today. It doesn't have to be anything big. I prefer it small because I don't want to break out an argument or something like that. But try talking to each other about something that's small. For the person who's speaking, all you're going to do is just try to describe, I got caught in traffic, or yesterday this little detail happened that made my day a little bit difficult, but share that with the other person. For the listener, what I want you to do on this first run is I want you to listen, but I also want you to also be busy with something else, like your phone or some other device. And I just want you all just to take a note of what this actually feels like when this happens. So if you don't mind, we'll just take about 60 seconds to do this quick exercise. And the second one, I'm going to give you a different instruction for how to listen more carefully. So one person start as a speaker, other person start as a listener. After 60 seconds rolls out, then I'll switch you around, and then I'll give you different instructions. So go ahead, and we can start this one, and then I'll ask the question again in a minute. So 60 seconds. All right, about 20 seconds. Okay, all right, go ahead and pause. And so now I want you to switch roles. The other person be the speaker, and the other person be the listener. Actually, no, stay in the same roles, but I'm gonna have you listen differently. So the speaker, I want you to speak again this time, but listeners, I want you to do 3 things. Number 1, I want you to ask a question that helps the person to explain to you why this bothered them. Like, whatever it was that bothered them, just simply throw out the question, why did this bother you so much? Okay? Second thing is, whatever it is that they say, validate the emotion. It's something as simple as, I can understand why you might feel that way. All right? Third one, is there anything you need from me? Okay? First one, why does this bother you so much? Second one, validate the emotion. I can understand why it makes you feel that way. Third one, is there anything you need from me? And it's fine if you all are just friends. It's just for the purpose of having a conversation, because it turns out these same listening skills are good for any relationship, not just a marital relationship. So go ahead, and then we'll do 60 seconds on this one, and then we'll come back and I'll explain some more. All right, about 15 seconds. Okay, all right. All right, so quick survey from the audience. All right, so first setting, when you were the speaker and the other person was distracted, what did you notice? Anybody want to give a quick account of what was it like to be the speaker and have the other person distracted? Frustrating? Yes? Right, okay, so it was a struggle to be distracted that way. All right, how about for anybody else? What did you notice talking to somebody who's distracted? Right, which interrupts what you're trying to share, right? I mean, like, it's like, how far do you really get into the story? Right, right, right. And so when that attention's not there, now we shift from actually just talking about something to now we're fighting about what we're doing here instead of really talking about what's happening, what's going on. So we stop having a real conversation. Anyone else? Okay. Right. Yeah, you lose motivation. Like, you kind of just start losing steam. It's like it doesn't really feel that satisfying to sit here and keep the conversation going if the person's not really listening to you. Now, sometimes it's innocently done that we can multitask, and sometimes we have to pick the right times to talk. But giving your undivided attention helps with the conversation. In fact, so in the second scenario, as the speakers, what did you notice in that second scenario when the person was trying to get to the bottom of what was going on? What did you notice as a speaker? It's more enjoyable to talk? Yeah. It actually feels like, okay, well, now I have something I can really share with you. Now I'm really engaged here. It feels better to actually speak with you when you're listening. Anyone else? It diffuses the stress of the, yeah, it diffuses the stress in the moment, which I was hoping somebody would say that too, because when we actually begin to voice what it is that we're feeling and somebody's really listening, our own stress levels begin to go down as we're listened to. It's this really strange thing, but it's not just in your imagination that you begin to feel better when you're talking to somebody. Your stress levels actually begin to diminish when you can express it to somebody when they're actually listening. It's actually like you get to share the burden, and the burden dissipates through listening, which is really incredible. You could physiologically watch this happen in your own bodies. It actually makes a difference. All right, anyone else as a speaker, what you noticed? Okay, if not, that's okay. So that's a good place to start. So what I want to do is I'm going to share a few tips with you, and maybe we can try to see if there's a way to get some of these printed out. But for this evening, okay, we there? Okay. So for this evening, the handout that you have is on how to be a great listener. It actually lists a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking to you all about. So a couple other things that they've suggested as a way to continue to have a conversation is, one, don't give unsolicited advice. Right? So like if your significant other comes home and says, man, I had this really messed up day at work, my boss was jumping all over me, and like I just forgotten to submit these reports, and now I'm now he's like he's put me on discipline and all this other stuff. And if you say, well, I told you need to start getting on top of your stuff. I told you if you keep doing things like this, you were going to get in trouble one day. Now, as the person who's reporting this to your significant other, if they just give you the I told you so response, how does that, like anybody, like how does that feel? Is that helpful in that moment? Like most of us, we already know when we made mistakes. Like we usually don't need someone else to point it out and like magnify it. Or if someone says, wife comes home and says, I really don't like my boss. Everybody there is so catty. They're always talking behind each other's backs. And then the spouse says, well, I told you just to leave the job. If you don't like it, why are you still working there? How do you think that response goes down? So usually the response is something like, now I have to defend myself. It's like, well, I can't just go get another job. If we just got another job, we wouldn't be able to pay for all these bills. And da-da-da-da-da. Now we're arguing. Now I have to defend the way that I feel instead of just being heard on how I feel. So no unsolicited advice, no told you so's, just listen. The fourth one is communicate your understanding. So help to clarify. So if we use that last scenario of everybody there is so catty, they always talk behind my back and blah, blah, blah. If I'm empathizing, what I'm going to say is, like, that really bothers you that people are talking behind your back. It's hard to trust anyone. Yes?
I know I'm not married, so I'm going to seem really ignorant here.
It's okay.
You're not the only. Okay. Gabby's right there. Okay, good. Okay. You shouldn't ever, I have this one thing I say sometimes. It's like, this is with someone I know. I will say, this sounds like a thought I have in my mind, and the thought is, I'm always funny about it. I'll say, he listened to me sooner.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the rest. But I just say, I
So it depends on how it started up. So that's a good question. So she was asking, like, are there times where you should just never do this? So the key word here is unsolicited advice, right? So it's not no advice ever. It's unsolicited advice. So if somebody's not necessarily asking for it, the timing has to be well. Now, you might want to get to the place where problem solving comes in. And the way that you did it is actually something that does help in all relationships, and that's like a soft startup. Like, so if you ease into it, it's like, well, I got this idea, but I don't know if you want to hear it. You know how I am sometimes when I share. Like, if I say it in a way that's humorous like this, it actually does a lot to ease the conversation. So check this out. 94% of the time, conversations will end the way they start. So if you start going 90 miles an hour with lots of intensity and harshness and criticism, it's going to end the same way. So start softly, and the conversation will end softly. 94% of the time, how the conversation starts determines how the conversation ends, and it will end the way it started. So start softly. All right, does that answer the question, though? Okay. Next one is communicate your understanding. The next one is take your partner's side. Take on more of like a against others attitude. So, your spouse comes home and says, oh, I can't believe everybody's so catty. It's like, yeah, you don't deserve to be treated like that. Join alongside your spouse. Now, this doesn't mean you always have to agree, but you definitely want to be on the other person's side. Like, that makes sense that you feel that way. I'm here for you. Something of that nature. Let the other person know that it's not you against the world, it's us. It makes sense so far? So communicate from that position of it's a we against others attitude. I could list examples, but sometimes people's language is colorful, so I'll pass on this one. All right, so express the we against others attitude. The next one is show affection. So sometimes we can underestimate how important it is that when you're talking to actually use physical touch. Now, this is true whether we're talking about talking with our children, talking with our friends, if you have that kind of relationship where you can, touch on the shoulder. I know with the work that I did when I worked with kids, sometimes I just give them a touch on the shoulder, but those things make a tremendous difference. There's actually some research that they did. This one was done by Datcher Keltner, and he had done research on touch. And he said that in his own lab, he had a study that was led by his former student, and we asked whether humans can clearly communicate compassion through touch. And so here's what we did, is what he says. We built a barrier in our lab that separated two strangers from each other. One person stuck his arm through the barrier and waited. The other person was given a list of emotions that he or she had to try to convey each emotion in 1 second through touch to the stranger's forearm. Now, that'd be kind of tough, right? And you can't cheat. You can't do like sign language and spell something out. You've only got 1 second, and most people who sign aren't quite that fast, right? And so they had to communicate with a touch what emotion they were trying to express to them. Now, here goes what the results were. Given the number of emotions being considered, the odds of guessing the right emotion by chance were about 8%. But remarkably, participants guessed compassion correctly nearly 80% of the time. A 1 second touch, and they can tell what it meant from a stranger. Okay. I like research sometimes. All right, it says, but remarkably, participants guessed compassion, let me go back to this one. So it's given the number of emotions, so they guessed correctly nearly 60% of the time. Gratitude, anger, love, fear, they got those right more than 50% of the time. How do you communicate fear through a touch? It's not well, maybe anger with that one, right? So yes, you can actually communicate these things through a 1 second touch. And people actually, again, this is with perfect strangers. Now, here goes the kicker here. It says, we had various gender combinations in the study, and the author says, I feel obliged to disclose that 2 gender differences were found. When a woman tried to communicate anger to a man, he got 0 right. Thought that was funny. He had no idea what she was doing. And when a man tried to communicate compassion to a woman, she didn't know what was going on. Is that interesting? So you could draw your own conclusions about that. I just figured that was a cute thing to share with you all. But physical touch is a really incredibly potent way of communicating to something to someone. I remember sitting with a couple, and while I was counseling with them, they had this just redundant fight over and over again, where we'll just call her Lucy. really just every time something would happen with her husband, she was always like distrustful, always thought that maybe he was going to be unfaithful or that she'd want somebody else instead of her, and just really struggled with that. And whenever she brought it up, he would get really angry and he'd want to withdraw. It's like, oh my gosh, I can never do anything to get you to trust me. And so like he just would just kind of stonewall, fold his arms, didn't want to talk, and then he would just not talk for a couple of days. And obviously this didn't really help her, because if she's afraid of him like abandoning her, the more he folds his arms and keeps silent, that's going to communicate to him like, oh, see, I can tell you don't care about me, because here I am over here hurting and you don't care, and that's just more evidence that you're going somewhere else. So you can see how this cycle would just keep building itself up. And so whenever she would try to communicate her insecurities to him, she was really struggling, like, how do I share this with you without driving you away? Because we did some work on that, helped them to identify what these emotions were and why it was that he'd feel this way. And oftentimes what would happen is he'd just feel like he was failing her and everything was becoming hopeless. So when he was crossing his arms and seemingly just getting upset, the reason he was upset is because he felt like there was no hope. And so as he began to communicate this, that he started feeling like he was failing, it would help the relationship a little bit. So Lucy and Mark we're having this conversation one day, and I was talking with Mark, and I said, hey, I noticed that even when you know why she's saying these things to you, it's still really hard for you to feel settled. And he's like, yeah. And I said, okay. Can we try something? Lucy, can you hold Mark's hand while you talk to him? And he's like looking, and then when they start to talk, she holds his hand, and he's like, you could see his posture just kind of like slump down, and he's all relaxed, and he's like, this is really weird, man, what's happening? So he was like, man, this is really weirding me out, like, what's going on? And like, he's just started feeling all these emotions, and as he was explaining it, he was just like, I don't know what it is, like when she's sitting here holding my hand, I actually feel like I'm safe. I can tell that she really does want me, she really does love me, that she's not trying to attack me, that I actually am safe. People don't always recognize what's going on inside, and sometimes words don't reach. But, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, then I suppose touch is worth a few million. All the reassurances in the world couldn't do what that touch did. So learn to use reassuring touch in your conversations. All right, last couple steps here. I'm going to read a couple of things for you. The last one is that we want to make sure that we're able to validate the emotions. So this is different from agreement. Like, I understand why you feel angry, understand why you feel sad, upset, whatever. That does not mean that the way that somebody's handling something is correct. It just simply means you can validate the emotion. So I have a little quiz for you all, and I want to see how well we do with this. So here's one exercise. Here's some sample scenarios below where you can practice being supportive when you're, what he calls your spouse's whining sessions. All right, so let's say your wife's brother yelled at her for not repaying money that he loaned her 2 months ago. She is feeling outraged and hurt by her brother's attitude. What is something you can say to her? What is something that the husband can say to the wife that actually might be validating? Anybody want to take a shot at it? So yeah. Okay, how does that make you feel? You can ask, like, hey, how is that making you feel there? Anybody else want to take a shot? What can you say in that scenario? Just paying back, okay. All right, so, yep, you could say something like that, and if they can receive it, if they're ready for that advice, then that could really land in a good place with them. If they're not ready for that advice, you might shift the approach. But yeah, you can say, hey, look, we could just get this over with by paying your brother back. Yes? How about we make a plan on how to pay him back? Okay, so let's kind of brainstorm together. Let's problem solve, right? Okay, all right. So problem solving, that is one way to respond. How about the second one? Your husband gets a speeding ticket, got a speeding ticket on his way home. It was a speed trap, he yells, everyone was going 80 miles per hour. Why do I have to be the one that gets pulled over? All right, how much you want to respond to that? And please don't say, you were driving too fast, that's what you get. All right, what might be a way to respond? If we're just, maybe I can ask the question a little differently. How do you think he's feeling right now getting a ticket? He's upset. Now, some of you have gotten those speeding tickets before, and when you get pulled over, what's one of the first things that you notice about your heart rate? Yeah, it's like pounding here. It's like, oh my goodness, here we go. And then when they hand you this ticket, and you realize that all your defense, like, officer, I'm sorry, you tried the I'm sorry route and all this other stuff, and then he still gives you this ticket, and you know it's going to be like several $100s. Okay. Now you got the ticket. How are you feeling as you're driving home? Right. Yeah. Right. And you're replaying the stupid tape in your head, right? Like, how can you be so stupid? How come I didn't see them? How come I couldn't tell? Like, I should have slowed down. What was I thinking? I saw that cop. How come we didn't get that guy? It's not fair. It's just on and on. Like, there's this difficulty in accepting the reality as it is. Life is not fair. Which, by the way, yes? Yeah? So tell me all about it. Tell me what you think about it. Have that open ear. And here's one that you can do. Now, the reason I had you all walk through that is if you know that those are all the emotional experiences a person is having, you might just try throwing some of that out there. Like, man, this probably really sucks right now. Like, this is really, I know you're probably experiencing a lot of regret. This really feels like it's unfair. Like, it's not cool. And if you can say something like that, the other person would just be like, yeah, that's exactly it. And then they kind of settle into the reality. Now we got to pay this thing off. Now let's make some plans. Let's figure out what we're going to do with our, what we're not going to get this week. Who's not going out for pizza, whatever that is. Figure out how to solve it. All right. So I won't give you all of these, but I'm just going to give you some of the sample answers. I'll just give you the sample questions and answers, just some things to practice here. In the third scenario, it says, your wife's getting home, getting to a big job interview. Now she's worried that she won't get the job. I can't believe how stupid I was, she moans. You say, think of something to say. The fourth scenario, your husband asked his boss for a raise and was turned down. He got angry and stormed out of his boss' office. Now he's worried that his boss will hold it against him. What can you say? So here's some sample answers. In the first one, where the person says that the brother wants the money, you might just be able to say something like, I'm sorry, made you feel really hurt and angry. And then what they put in parentheses is, poor baby, which is kind of like that, oh. But don't do that in a patronizing way because that won't go over very well. But it is a way of saying, I get it. Like, it makes sense that you feel hurt. It makes sense that you feel angry. The second one, getting the ticket, it's like, how outrageous if that's so unfair, which is exactly what I heard somebody say over there. That's not fair. This doesn't make sense. If you can join them with that, again, it has an effect on bringing that person's emotions down. And the third one, where it feels like I did everything stupid on this job interview, and how could I do that? Being able to say you weren't stupid, or that could have been anybody. Because we can all relate to that experience. We've all had those job interviews where we stumbled over our words, we tried to say a million things at once. Anyway, I'll spare you all my job interview stories because they're embarrassing. Anyway, the fourth one is being able to say, I understand how you feel. So just see if you can connect and relate to it. Okay, so the last thing on this last one here with the turning towards, something that I wanted to be able to share with you all is the importance of how you choose your words. Because word choice makes all the difference in terms of how the other person is going to respond. So if we're considering what is happening when you are making the decision to share something that was deeply meaningful to you with somebody else, I want you to recognize as the listener, it's actually a privilege that somebody really wants to talk to you about things that bother them. Now I want you to think for a second, like how many people do you really let in on the things that really bother you? If you think about how many people only know you by the person that they see passing through the halls at work or see you in the grocery store, and how people have no idea what's really going on in your life. People are actually very reluctant. I mean, even as a counselor, I have times where people will wait like 6-8 months to let me know that some huge thing had happened in their lives, because even in a situation where I can be sued for talking about what goes on, people will still be reluctant to share. It is a tremendous privilege when somebody lets you inside. And if you can treat it like one, then things change for that other person. There were a couple of authors who had talked about, there's a book called Words Can Change Your Brain. It's written by Andrew Newberg and Mark Robert Waldman. And they talk about how words can actually affect your brain. They said that a single word has the power to influence the expression of genes that regulate physical and emotional stress. To put that in everyday English, what someone chooses to say to you doesn't just make you feel like more stressed out in a given moment. It begins to reprogram your autonomic nervous system. Your fight or flight system will actually get reprogrammed by the kind of words that you're constantly exposed to. So if I just gave you a little experiment, I just want you just to notice what happens. I'm going to repeat a word about 6 or 7 times. I just want you to notice what happens. So just only concentrate on what's happening inside. No. 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 Okay. What happens when you hear that? Isn't that interesting? I mean, like, it's one word. Isn't that, I mean, that's intense. Adrenaline begins to shoot through your bloodstream. You begin to have all kinds of stress hormones like adrenocorticotropic hormone. You can go down this long list of hormones that all begin to release in your bloodstream. And what happens is if you're constantly exposed to it, your nervous system will actually get more sensitive over time, and you'll actually begin to release that same stress response even quicker. So if I was in the constant habit of coming around you saying that all the time, aside from the fact that you probably wouldn't want to be around me, you would learn to become stressed out before I even really start talking. And your body will reprogram itself based on the words that you hear. Let's think about this. This is one word 7 times in like 22 seconds, and you can feel your entire nervous system begin to react to it. Somebody had that? Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's the words and the tone, all of it. Because if I just said, no, 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 I can just mess with that a little bit, and the tone will make all the rest of the difference between the two. Words can actually change your brain. So what words you choose and how you say them actually makes a huge difference. So when you're listening compassionately, learn to use your voice to help the person begin to settle down. So here's something that I do. Somebody's really elevated. They come in the office and they're just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe what's happened. They're crying. They're really, and I just say, okay, it seems like a lot has happened today. Yes, da-da-da-da-da. They keep talking. And I say, can I ask you a question? Now, the reason I say, can I ask you a question, is not because I necessarily need permission. It's because I want them to just listen really carefully. And then here's how I begin to talk. I say, there's so many times where you feel like you've been overlooked, and it's so hard when you have to keep walking into that scenario over and over and over again. And it's difficult when it feels like nobody cares. But at the same time, I think I heard you say before that there's this part of you that really wants to feel valued. It's not really the case that you want to end your life. You just want your life to be different. You want someone to understand you. And then they'll say something like, yes, exactly. And then their affect will begin to tone down. Now, as I'm talking that way, what do you notice as you're listening to that? Does anybody feel anything like when I'm talking that low and talking that slow? Does anybody notice anything? Oh, you couldn't hear me, so that's not helpful, is it? Okay. It's calming, right? So what begins to happen? Yes? Right. So sorry, you couldn't hear me. Sorry, I should have spoke up just a little bit louder, but that makes it hard to have the same effect. But yes, it actually forces the person to focus more. I'm slowing my speech down as well, because then the person is actually listening more carefully to what I have to say. Because if I said, hold on one second, just sit right there, I understand everything that's going on right now. If I talk like that, then, I'm just keeping them on the roller coaster. Words can change your brain. They can change how you feel in a given moment. I wanted to show you all just a really quick clip here, and this one is of a dad and his son. And I want to see if this works here. So we'll see if this sound comes through, and if there won't be any sound. It won't let you do it from up here? I could try it. Okay. All right. Well, I'll have to show you that later. No. Right. Okay. Well, maybe next time if I can find that one for you, I'll show that one to you next time. So anyway, in that particular video, it's actually one that if you can find it, it was a dad and his son, and you actually see them having this really engaging conversation between each other, but the kicker in it is that the kid doesn't know how to talk. In fact, you know what, I'll, just for the sake of it, maybe at least you can get the visual there. Can you see this up here? Okay, so you won't be able to hear it as Mark pointed out. But if you just watch their nonverbals with each other, look at what is going on between this kid and his dad. Okay. Now, if you're watching that, what is going on between that dad and his child? A kid cannot talk at all, but what is happening with them? Oh, man. And anyway, you have to look it up. It's probably one of the cutest things I think I've seen before. It's gotten like over 1 million views because like so many people have seen this. No verbal conversation, but everything, that kid knows that he is being heard and he is just putting on a show. It's really cute. So anyway, just imagine something really cute and then pretend like you just watched it and you all said, "Aw," and so you can hold on to that moment. Become effective listeners. If you can listen carefully, then you can also begin to build up more of that positivity, more of that nurturing and fondness and admiration within the relationship. Okay. All right. So for this evening, as I said, there are some handouts that we have for this evening. The first one is actually a questionnaire. So you'll see the one that says Fondness and Admiration Questionnaire. On there, it has about 20 questions on there that you just go through and do true and false. What it does is it actually helps you to assess how you're doing in terms of having that fondness and admiration. So some of the questions on there are questions like, I can easily list 3 things that I most admire about my partner, true or false. Now, by the way, if your score is low, this does not mean that all hope is lost. It just means it's something that we need to build up. Another question on there is, I will often find some way to tell my partner I love you. Or, my partner really or my spouse really respects me. I feel loved in this relationship. So these are the true and false questions. So what you want to do is go down and list all those. And if they're low points, it's not for you to take it to your spouse and say, see, you don't make me feel loved. It's to say, I think these are areas that we need to be able to work on. These are some places where I think we can build a little bit more. The second one is your marriage primed for romance? Now, one of the questions that we got in today was about this particular one, like what if the passion and romance in our relationship is gone? These questions right here really help to address what it is that allows passion to build back up in the relationship. And notice what some of the questions are. We enjoy doing small activities together, like washing the dishes or watching TV. When's the last time you read any books that talked about one way to build up the passion in your relationship is to wash dishes and to watch TV together? When we go out together, the time goes very quickly. We tend to share the same basic values. We spend time together in similar ways. These are the things that begin to kindle a fire in the passion in your relationship. So that's the second one there, is your marriage primed for romance? And these are really the things that lead to it. So again, it has the scoring that's listed afterwards. And as I said, the handout is going to be being a great listener, the art of listening, and to create intimate conversations. So each night, by the next night, we're going to be looking at the next 2 principles that are in the foundation, in the relationship house, and they're going to begin moving up the ladder in terms of how to deal with conflicts. Because sometimes you can have conflicts where you get gridlocked, like it's the same argument every single time. We're going to be talking about directly how you begin to address those and how you can prevent those arguments from happening over and over again, and how to really get to some problem solving and solutions. And then, of course, on the last night, we'll be looking at the rest of the sound relationship house. We'll be looking at dreams and admiration, how you begin to cast a vision for your own lives together, and we'll talk more about that and how those things play into the conflicts and how to resolve them more effectively. All right. So before we close for this evening, I always like to try to make sure that if there are any questions, anyone have any questions or anything that would be useful for me to clarify here before we dismiss for this evening. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you go ahead and review those numbers because they'll let you know if those are things that need to be built up. Both this, so the one that we gave out last time on fondness and admiration is actually linked with some of the questions that we have here and that we talked a bit about tonight. I just wanted to give you an advance of this one. So the handouts are going to be going through a lot of information in a short amount of time. But if you notice that this one on fondness and admiration, it's like a 7-week thing. So this actually will go beyond what we're just doing here. But these are ways to build those things up. So when you go through that questionnaire that's talking about having that fondness and admiration, if you have a lower score on there, try using some of the exercises that are in there to help build that up for yourselves. Yes? Mm-hmm.
What I've heard, and because I was asking about this defensiveness,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the, I guess, the triggers for this defensiveness?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Theory one is the spark. If you ever have this spark where you really love someone, then you're more easily hurt by, a person,
Mm-hmm.
than if you've never known that. But what are those things that
Yeah, okay. So the question was, what is it that causes, what's the cause of the defense in the relationship? All right, so I'll give you the short answer. The short answer is that when somebody says something that lets them know that whatever need they have is not going to be met, then that's responded to defensively. That's one way that it can happen is, I have this need, I don't really know how to ask for it from you, but then you give me these signals that my need is never going to be met by you, and then I'm going to start feeling angry and defensive, and so anytime something touches on that nerve that lets me know that that need's not going to be met in the relationship, that can kick it up. So forgive me if the answer's a little bit generic, just because it's, we're talking about like all across the span of relationships, what it is that tends to do it. The second one is it's a vulnerability. So if this is an area where I am sensitive, like let's just say that, I grew up in an environment where, my dad was like really aggressive and always kind of yelled at me and all this stuff, and if I ever tried to speak out of line or if I ever showed any emotion, if I cried, he slapped me in the face and said, quit being a baby and quit being a little girl and all these kind of things to me, then if you say something that even hints toward the idea that I'm not man enough, it's on. Because I'm having a defensive response, but it's because it's touching a sensitive nerve that my spouse did not necessarily create. So those are the two major things, is it's a vulnerability or it's an unmet need. So just generically speaking, that's generally what you mean. You can just filter it on down. Those are usually going to be at the foundation of it. Yes? Mm-hmm. Right. So that experience of abandonment, so just repeating that. What he was saying is that he noticed that sometimes it can come down to this sense of being abandoned, that no one actually cares about me, which kind of goes back to that need again, right? Like I need to feel accepted. I need to feel like I belong. I need to feel like I matter to someone. And if I get some hint that I don't matter, and it could be really small, like just not listening to me. I was trying to tell you something that really mattered to me. I was really emotionally invested in what I was saying, and you were on your phone. And now it's on again. Now it's up to the defenses again because you've just hit that vulnerability. You've hit that need that says, I'm not wanted, I'm not accepted, I don't belong, and then we're off again. So those are the two things. And everybody carries these, by the way. Like we don't lose our needs and we don't lose our vulnerabilities, but we learn how to meet those needs. We learn how to nurture those vulnerabilities when we do see them. Yes? Yes, yeah, and we're kind of moving through these principles at kind of lightning speed, but yes, yeah. So this was the first night we were really talking more about the turning towards. So, but it is a good technique to do. It's good to make sure that when your spouse is talking, you may even just try this for at least 5 minutes a day. When your spouse is talking with you, try doing exactly what we did here, or even with your friends or family member, like really turn toward them and ask some of those questions, like, why does this bother you? Why does this mean so much to you? What's happening here? Like really ask those questions sincerely, and just notice what happens even in your friendships and your relationships with each other. But just try that out. But yeah, the turning toward, we're just now talking about this evening, and then unfortunately next time we meet, we're going to be off to the next few principles. So this is a really fast overview of a lot of skills and practices. So any other questions? Yeah. The acronym for DARN. Oh, yeah. So if somebody doesn't want to change, so this one actually comes from a totally different. This is from motivational interviewing. It's another therapeutic technique. But DARN is desires, abilities, reasons, and needs. What is it that the person wants that they don't have? What abilities do they have that would help them to, achieve whatever that desire is? What are the reasons that they have for wanting whatever it is that they want? And what are the needs that are not being met by not changing? That just gives somebody an intrinsic reason to make a change for themselves. Now, please don't use this to manipulate your spouse and get them to say, like, man, I really do need, like, a 6-bedroom house, and, so don't use it to, like, manipulate each other, but really try to find out, like, what in the relationship, like, that would be mutually beneficial to that person, get them to think more about those, on those terms. All right, may I have time for, like, just one more question? Any more, like, is there, like, one more question before we wrap up? If not, then please make sure to write down the questions and leave them there, and I'll make sure to start the next meeting with them. But any further questions before we close up? Okay, all right, well, let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and dismiss for this evening. And again, we'll be meeting here next week at 6 p.m., so we hope to see you all come out again. Please do take care.